Welcome back to part 2 of ComX, part of the Aussie Comic Book Day live stream all day from ComX. This is the third show, but the second one by ComX. We're here with Spedsy and Haydn to talk about world building and storytelling. So this is a great way to spend Aussie Comic Book Day.
All right, start us off, Shane. What did you? You had a 40-minute monologue ready to go, I believe. Is that the
40
go?
minutes? Yeah. I've lost it. Sorry. I'll have to do it off the top of my head. So what do you guys want to concentrate on?
I mean, I think it's a bigger topic than 40 minutes even, Spedsy. So let's see how we go getting through it. World building, storytelling, they go hand in hand, obviously. But I guess let's start with the big one. How do you define it, Rob?
How do I define world building? Well, I guess, wow. Yeah, awesome question. Well, that would be picking, your genre of your world, whether it's like a fantasy world, a sci-fi, real world.
Just so you're together. Oh no, I stuffed you up.
Is he frozen? He's frozen.
Yeah, he's frozen.
Sorry.
Oh, there you go. How's your internet? Oh no. That's not from what I did, I swear.
Well, I don't know. I think he's just ducking out of answering the question.
Yeah. No, sorry. I'll pretend none of that happened. World building is, in my mind, well, it's building a world. Establishing the rules of that world, the genre that you plan to play in, and then it depends how far down the rabbit hole you go. Whether you start talking about governing bodies and post-apocalypse, what it caused the apocalypse, or all those sorts of things. What's your sort of tagline definition of world building?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to sit here and tell you you're wrong. You're right. But yeah, I think it's it's both creating and then elaborating on the world in which your story is set. Like, it's a very sort of, I guess it sounds simple, doesn't it? But it's super complicated once you actually get into the nitty-gritty. So I think I don't even think it necessarily has to be something that 100% when you start telling a story, especially in a serialized medium like ours. I think that you want some fundamentals in place. You want to understand your world. You want to, and like you said, it has to do with your setting, which has to do with your genre, which has to do with your, your narrative. It's all reliant on one another. But sometimes you will learn as you go, and sometimes just like the characters might dictate your storytelling. Sometimes I think that the world you're setting a story in will dictate the process itself. And I agree, Dave. It's 50% of it. So I guess talk to us a little bit about what Devil's Toilets, how that world has unraveled for you. I understand that that's been kind of what I've just said, is that it had some fundamentals that you took into it, and then it's just sort of grown and developed as you've introduced new elements along the way. Would I be right?
Yeah. Well, I think it also comes down to, I think this is why you and I work so well together, because in lots of ways we're polar opposites, and then we sort of, it's kind of like, there's the architect and the gardener, that sort of, and I think I know which, for those who don't know, like the architect storyteller is the person who plans out everything, has their world built before they start writing, maybe has an outline, maybe even has plot points before they go into a story. And then there's the gardener who has sort of, sorry, my dog really wants to come in. And then he's like, I've got stuff to say. And then there's the gardener, which is sort of like you start with a germ of an idea, and you just start typing, and you sort of go where it takes you. I feel like I'm a gardener, sort of, especially novel writing and a little bit in comic book writing, where I sort of start with there's a toilet, it becomes sentient, and it's in hell, and that's. I mean, I envision you being an architect. Would that be right?
It would be right, and I think that I was to a detriment for a very long time. And what I mean by that is, for a long time I was trying to write stories, and I was too focused on knowing everything I felt I needed to know about the story before I started telling it. And as you said, I had notes, I had I had documents, I had spreadsheets.
Yeah.
But it would take me to the act of actually writing it, and then it lost something from all of that. So it sounds like I'm making an argument against world building and preparation, and I'm absolutely not. But I guess my example is one in which I went too far the other way. But you mentioned novel writing as well, and you've done both. So you've done novels, you've done comics now. Do you feel like there was a difference in your process developing those worlds, or not really?
Yeah, I feel like, well, especially comics that I'm going to draw, I feel like there's less time. World building is something that, like, a story can get bogged down with too much world building, I think, and especially like if in a comic book, if you spend the first 10 pages just an information dump about this world, as opposed to using your character to walk through the world, if you know what I mean. Like if it's full of narration boxes saying, in the year 2020 the world fell apart and now the so and so government rules the whatever, and it's like, we haven't even met the main character yet. Whereas it's tricky. I feel like you've got more time in a book to explore some ideas. Does that sound like a thing, or is that just my brain?
I mean, it does sound like a thing, and I think that, to your point about info dumping, it's very much that show don't tell sort of thing, and I think that's where the artist plays an equal role in building
Absolutely.
the world as the writer. It's a testament to some of the artists I've worked with where that they've arguably built the world better than I have. I've written the script, and then I've got an idea of what that world looks like, and then they bring it to life and they introduce things that I had no idea about, and it sort of sets you on this new creative course that still feels right for the story, but that is very revealing even to you. So it's just another reason why you can't wait for people to read it, because if you had that moment with it, then the reader might too.
Of course, yeah. I didn't think I was just thinking as a writer of a comic and a writer of a book, but of course you have visuals in a comic that in panel 1 you can kind of show people what the world looks like, as opposed to in a book you got to spend 2 pages explaining what the world looks like, and you've got to do that in a way that's not the info dump. I mean, I find it a good way to world build without to introduce someone to a world is to have the character be introduced. I mean, maybe it's a cop out, but like the fish out of water sort of thing, where you dump a character in this world and they don't know anything, just like the reader doesn't know. And so things are explained to the character as a trick to basically explain them to the reader.
Yeah, I mean, the everyman sort of idea, which is really, really successful for high fantasy or really complicated hard sci-fi, when if everybody is so attuned to the world that the story is set in but the reader isn't, then there's going to be a disconnect. So an everyman character is a really good way around that. I agree.
Sorry, I realized I explained what an architect storyteller is with not really giving what the gardener is. a gardener. Did I sort of explain that, like, starts with an idea and the metaphor being that then they water the idea as they go through the story, and they sort of watch it grow before their eyes. Like, some of my favorite writing moments have been things that just happened. Like, I think I was telling you the other day, sorry, this is Zach. I once had someone tell me I write so the audience learns as my character learns. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like you were saying.
Yeah. No, yeah. So I was telling you the other day, Hayden, about and this would be the gardener storyteller in me. I was writing what will become Devil's Toilet 3. It was also part 3 of the Frederick Trelawney in ComX. How I had Frederick Trelawney, he's a turtle detective from the year 1888, and he's brought into the future to stop the apocalypse, basically. And he meets a character, and so basically he's had this whole story that's played out on the page, and then he meets a character who asks him how he got there. And now the reader's already read it all. So how do you convey the information to that new character without having to put the reader through it again, if you know what I mean? And so I started typing the cop-out version, which was, you know, how did you get here? And he replies, it's a long story. And then, other way around. How did you get here? And then she replies, it's a long story. And he says, well, I've got all day. Oh no, that's okay. I've got time. And then she says, well, do you? And I just typed that because I was like, I just want to get past this scene because it's a nothing scene and get onto something else. But then I was like, wait, why would she think that he doesn't have time? And then I started, ding, bing, 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 bing. I start going, wait, he's been brought into the future. What if some sort of, you can't escape Father Time? What if he's about to start rapidly aging? Like, I wish I could remember the movie. There was a movie in the late 80s, early 90s, maybe, where a guy was frozen. He was sick or something, and he was frozen until there was a cure. And they brought him back to life. And then
I don't know that one.
And then he rapidly aged to the... Anyway, long story short, by not planning, by sort of gardening my way through the story, I stumbled on this plot that I was just like, oh my goodness. But then I guess maybe as an architect, do you have those oh my goodness moments when you're outlining it?
I mean, not always. And I think sort of narratively, as you're outlining the actual beats of the story, sometimes you don't know them all, and that's one of the best parts. Sometimes you're writing and you think you know where you're going, and then you go somewhere else. But I think that one thing that when it comes to world building is that if we do have those moments where we're gardening it, because I do that as well, more these days than I used to, a little bit. But if we are doing it that way, do you have any checks and balances that you keep in mind when you're writing? Because you don't want to break any rules, right? You don't want to change things too dramatically. This is a story world that, especially if you're 2 or 3 or more issues into it, your audience has something that they're expecting at this point. So it's sort of giving the reader something new without cheating the DNA of what that thing was to begin with. Do you sort of get what I'm saying? And do you have any methods?
Yeah. Do I have a method? It's a very messy method where you then have to go back in the second draft and fix all the times where you broke the rules in the first go. I don't know. It's hard because it's a lot of work. It's maybe it seems easy. I don't know, and maybe it is easy to some, but it can be a lot of work, especially like writing for Gary Della at Reverie Publications. Sometimes he has a germ of an idea and says run, and other times he has like these very specific 6 things he wants you to hit, and they're vastly different, and he somehow wants you to connect those dots. And I like that challenge, but it can be hard trying to make it make sense. But to your point, which I have forgotten, no, you were saying, sorry, remind me what the core of the question was. I had it
Well, I
until
guess
I
just
started going the Gary Della
yeah.
report.
Whether you have any, and I mean, you raise a really interesting point, is that it's especially true when you're writing someone else's IP.
Yeah.
You not only can't cheat your own rules, but you can't cheat the rules that have been established. I mean, we say that, but retcons happen all the time. But I think there still are fundamentals to the world that you're writing in that you have to be true to. Can you think of an example, say within Torn, you've got one issue out in print and I'm lettering your third one. So things are happening there. But so you've been writing Torn and you've been writing Rick as well long enough that I wonder if you've had this experience where you've sort of had to revisit what other writers have done, or you've had to even check in with Gary, whatever it might be. So yeah, those checks and balances, are they different for when you're writing for Gary or someone else?
Yeah, well, so to tie up my horrible answer a moment ago, so yeah, my method would be, at least when novel writing, it's just start writing. And then I remember the last book I did, I got 2,000 words in, and that's when I found it. And I was like, whoa, this is what it is. I found where it is and where I'm going. And then I started to go back and try and make it work, and then I just deleted it all. But that 2,000
Well, I was about
words,
to say, if I know you've told me about Dave's rule of Dave DeVries' rule of starting when the story starts and cut the first part. Did you cut those 2,000 words?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the Gary Della world building of it all. So very curious. So Torn is technically a world that's already built. However, when I started writing it, only one issue existed, and so with plans for that story to continue before my story would take place. So I cheated and I kind of built my own separate version of the Torn universe, that Torn, once he's finished his adventures over there, would come into my sort of version of it. And I like to think I kept the sort of the skeleton of the Torn character, and just added a few little things here and there, but otherwise introduced him. The good thing about Torn is that it's in the real world with these hyperhumans running about, and so there wasn't like I could just introduce my own hyperhumans, stay away from other people's sort of big grandiose plans, and start laying seeds for my own plans. Then there was when Gary. This is funny because so when Gary Della first got me to write the Torn Southern Squadron crossover, he laid out for me what he wanted. He wanted the villain to be this guy called the Touch, and he said, "I want you to find a way to." Here's the Touch is a guy with an inoperable brain tumor. He can also touch people, and when he touches them, they catch on fire. And when the doctor tells him that his tumor is inoperable, he sets the doctor on fire. Torn and Southern Squadron fight that guy and go. And I was like, what? Okay. So I immediately wanted to tell the backstory of this guy, how he got to this point. I took the brain tumor element and made that be the reason why, sort of maybe it's pushing on a particular part of his brain that's driven him a bit crazy to then use these latent powers that he got when he was a kid and start using them for evil. Then I did some reading of some Southern Squadron books, and I found the Southern Squadron back in the day had a particular doctor that when they were injured, they went to see. So I was like, all right, well, it's the same doctor. So this guy, the Touch, he's in Torn's universe. He kills that doctor. Southern Squadron come in to find out what's up, and then suddenly Torn and Southern Squadron are together, and Night Fighter's, he's a bit of a mouthy sort of a jerk. Torn's a mouthy sort of a jerk. Yeah, this is what happened, Dave. And I was really happy with the touch part of the story, which we ended up. So, I mean, just to wrap that story. So then we handed the script to Dave, and Dave was sort of like, "Oh, I thought we were going to write together," and I was like, "Oh, I don't know. I was told this," and typical sort of wires crossed at Reverie, but it's all fun and games. And then we got to start it again from scratch, me and Dave. But I still had that. Gary still wanted that touch story, so now I'm like, oh man, I should have just swapped out the Southern Squadron for the Devil's Toilet, and this thing writes itself. But I got to keep most of the stuff that I had written, and just put some other characters in the place where the Southern Squadron were, and so on. But now in terms of Rick, well, that's another thing, because you set up the Rick world. And it's a similar story where when I was asked to start writing it, only one issue existed. And so there were things that I couldn't touch, specifically told, don't touch Lorraine, which was the character that you had created, because there might be plans for her. I wanted to name the dog, because the dog had just been called Dog, and that was being reserved for you. What was building that world like, the Rick McClune world, which now is like, there's a Kickstarter running right now where 4 comics are built on the back of your first one.
Well, it's hilarious that you mentioned the dog, because Gary was messaging me for months asking me to send him the name of the dog, and kept reminding me that you got to name the dog in your script. And I just could not decide on a name. Like, it's almost like there was more pressure each time he told me to name the dog, that in the end I just said, nah, it's just called Dog, and the little girl is going to name it at some point, but I'm not making that call. So if you haven't read Rick 1, then that little tangent made no sense. But writing Rick was a lot of fun. It was, and me and Ben Sullivan, the artist, have a hilarious story where he didn't know I existed until the book hit print. He didn't know who the writer was, so we never met before it. We never met when I was writing it or when I'd written it. And so that book is a really interesting example of, I wrote a certain thing and it's fun. Its foundations are very much there, and then Ben got to interpret it. And this is kind of going back to what I said before. He did as much, if not more, of the world building than I did, because he created the look and feel of the town in which it's set. And we've got Rick sort of riding through, dead land at one point. And I think this is something about Western, and it goes back to what world building can be, because it's not just the big picture, building your whole world in which the story is set, but it's also every single scene and every single issue. So, if you've said it, if you have, and Western's obviously it's very common, if it's set in sort of the hot, dry land, heat and ice, that kind of weather sort of, it's deadly. Like, it gives off this impression of really desolate sort of, no one survives, and if you do survive, it's character building. So immediately, if we have a character that we're following through a world like Rick's in the Wild West, we immediately know that character is a tough son of a bitch, because it's a tough world, and Ben sort of makes that very real. Simultaneously, if you're writing, if you've written scenes in the rain, right? Rain gives us like this sort of morbid sense of hopelessness or sense of gloom, and I think that says so much about the scene that it's taking place in. It's probably why I love Chiloney so much, Rob, is that it's set in rainy 19th century England or 18th century, I can't remember, and I love that aesthetic as just as a reader. That's sort of my vibe. So I'm really into that look and that feel and that atmosphere. And you look at cyberpunk stories like Blade Runner, of course, but a lot of those examples are set in kind of dystopian cities, and it's always raining or it's smoggy, and so all of those decisions, they're big and they're small, and in serialized stories you can change it, right? Like if you switch from day to night, in a story that's been predominantly day, that's a big decision that you're making for that issue or that scene that you're setting it in, and the less you use that storytelling device, the more noticeable it is, and the more the reader is going to realize, even subconsciously, that there's something you're trying to convey that's different to what you were before. So that's kind of a tangent, and I kind of got away from Rick for a bit there. But I guess writing Rick was that idea of not fire, though, Zach.
I think he may have been being sarcastic. I know I hate
really?
Smoke is a good thing to cover up some stuff. But rain, yeah.
I guess Rick was this idea of writing a Western. So I did my research and I watched the movies and I read about what makes a Western a Western. Not to say that I did it perfectly. I'm pretty sure I made errors along the way. And then that's where it's sort of been smoothed out my rough edges, I think. But there's even the layout of the panels in that book. I think that Rick 1 is a stunning book, and the way that it looks like, wall paintings in a wild West cathedral. Like, it's all just really beautiful.
Yeah, for those that don't know, we're talking about Rick McClune, the second fastest gun in the West, from Reverie Publications, which is actually available on Kickstarter right now, issues 1 through to 5. Being a Western, like a real world Western, does that make the world building easier, or does it has to be more specific because suddenly now the rules are set, and so now you've got to tell the story of this town, and I guess the rule, like my Rick, because your story was, I had no idea where it was off to, so I had to do the Torn thing, take Rick and I put him in a new town, and I'm horrible at history, and I hate the confines of needing to adhere to things, so I just created my own town. I was like, all right, where's like a good place to put it, where there was like, somewhere near the Great Railroad, but I can just call it Dirt Town, and no one really knows specifically which town I'm talking about. But then within that town, like, did you, like, I had a sheriff that was, older and maybe not totally competent, and so that means that the town is a little more lawless, perhaps. Did you get into that sort of world building of it all, like down to that sort of nitty gritty stuff?
I didn't actually for Rick. I almost felt like Rick exists in this like alternate universe, American Wild West. I think that because we aren't American, I think there's this element of I did some research, but I didn't find a way in which to actually insert that research, and I didn't feel like I wanted to or needed to. But I think that you raise a really good point about research, and educating yourself as being a really big part of world building, especially if it's set in the real world. You mentioned that your Torn is set in, you sort of cheated and decided to tell like your own adjacent story, but as you said, it's set in the modern Australia. So it's still set in the Torn world because that just is what it is, and you can create technology, or you can introduce certain science fiction-y elements there, because I think a lot of superhero storytelling is science fiction to at least some extent. Although Not Your Torn and Southern Squadron is serious high fantasy from what little I've seen of it so far. I would actually love for you to talk to me about that, because that is a really good example of world building. You and Dave worked really hard on that to establish a whole bunch of rules, and then you slotted these really well-known characters into that world. So for those who don't know what it is, give us a little bit of a rundown of what Torn and Southern Squadron, the team up is, and then give us a rundown of that world building process.
Well, Southern Squadron, obviously an iconic Australian book, and then Torn, an upcoming, potentially iconic, maybe one day with all the crossovers that are happening. It's definitely forcing its way into the Australian comic zeitgeist. Well, so I guess world building for Torn. So by the time we started writing that, I'd already written 6 issues of Torn, and kind of established my spot in the Torn universe. Obviously, there are issues upon issues of the Southern Squadron, so I had to do my reading. But then at the same time, some of those books are no longer sort of classified as canon, sort of like the new canon of Southern Squadron. But that's where Dave kicks ass, because he handed me basically this Bible that was like, here's everything you need to know about everything. So as far as like it was almost daunting. There was so much information. But any question I had was right there. So in terms of world building, we were dealing with the real world, and we were kind of dealing with a Torn's version of the real world, Southern Squadron version of the real world. And that's always a tricky thing. So that, I mean, they technically exists in the same universe, but it's that sort of like Marvel thing where you're reading Iron Man and the world's about to fall apart and only Iron Man can stop it. And then you're reading Thor, and in Thor, the world's falling apart and only Thor can stop it. And it's just like, why doesn't Iron Man come help Thor? And why doesn't Thor, because that's not the story. The story is this guy's journey. So why didn't Southern Squadron hold such awesome. So I feel like we spent more time character building than world building, which was building a team of villains, which when we spent so much, and this was I would say Dave's definitely an architect versus my gardener, which was really cool for me to have to work as an architect, if that makes sense. I handed him my gardener version of the plot breakdown, which I, discovered as I went. But then we found once we created these villains together, everything else just fell into place. So we were taking 2 existing worlds, pretending that they'd been one the whole time, I guess. But then once we introduced this fantastical element, which, maybe it's a cheat, they just come through portals from their world. We didn't have to spend, that's a thing too. We thought a lot about these characters, and their backstories became more and more fascinating. We have this character who's an elf, and he's so they're not called this in the book, but this was our shortcut name. They're called the Fantasy Five, and we had a giant, an elf, a goblin, a fairy, and one other one I can't remember. And so they're all from different parts of this same sort of Tolkien-like dimension sort of thing. But the more we went into so everyone had their attitude, and why do they have this attitude? And in a way, it's a shame we didn't have 20 issues to explain it all, because we gave them all such elaborate backgrounds. But it would bog the story down. The stories about Torn and the Southern Squadron let's just give them people to fight. So we tried to add as many layers to these characters as we could while not soaking up page count from the characters people came to see. Yeah, so there's an elf type character who's like the prince of his kingdom, and he denies the throne, sort of thing, and he's a bit of a mole rat, sort of Kevin Smith sort of a character who's like, every second word is meh because he can't be bothered. And then so we bring him into this world where there are real stakes and people are getting hurt and it's time to fight, and he can't be bothered and that's more a character building thing, but we sort of set these rules for these characters, and then once we put them together, the story wrote itself because we knew how these people would react. And so we almost had to just say, here's what's happening. And then it was cause and effect for a lot of these characters because, well, he would react this way, she'd react that way. And then suddenly all these moments come that you're just like, we need to see this, we need to see that. That's awesome.
So these villain characters, did you say that they came from an alternate dimension sort of thing? Or are they? Yeah. Okay, so I'll pitch you something. You're probably going to hate me for this, but
no.
If I would ask you right now, how would you go about world building if you were asked by Reverie or asked by Dave to start writing a first issue of a spin-off that was set in the dimension that these villains came from? How would you go about building that world?
So my original pitch was that they all came from separate places, and I think Dave said to keep it more streamlined, they all come from the same place, which in like some of the backstories that I had started working out kind of, as I say, this elf is a prince type character. So then does that make him a leader over these other characters? Which was not a road we wanted to go down. We wanted them all to be separate sort of entities and, all bowing to our big bad sort of thing. So I just sold it to myself. There's different regions within this world. So that's as far as I went. So if I was to world build, I guess, I'd go, all right, so there was 5 characters. 2 of them were related. They were twins, which was our funny. So one's a giant and one's a dwarf, but they're twin girls. Because we tried to take every character and spin it on its head. So like we had a Tinkerbell character, like a fairy, but then, on the panels where you get to move in close, it's actually a dude and he's more like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but he's this big sort of thing. Carries a big gun that for us is this big, but for him it's like a Rob Liefeld type weapon. What would I do? So that would be 4 regions within this world. So I guess I would start from there, and then I'd start naming the regions. Maybe that would are they magic based? Hey, Ronnie boy. Yeah, I mean that's the thing too. If you go too far down the rabbit hole, it's kind of like only build as much world as you plan to use. Would you agree with that? Because then,
yeah, that's a really interesting way to put it. Because that gives you room to breathe. And I think something that I was doing a lot when I started writing comics was going too far beyond that, which means that you may find that you've put up walls for yourself when it comes to writing future stories if you get to that point. So and that goes back to our point of having checks and balances. So keeping a record of what you're doing with that world, no matter what stage you're creating these elements, whether you're 5 issues in and you're developing the politics of that world further, or you're whatever it might be, but making sure that still stays true to what you've written so far.
Like for example, if I said, all right, so I just determined a moment ago that there's 4 regions in this planet, right? in this world. But then on issue 3, I have this genius idea for this big bad that is a different creature, and he comes from the 5th region, and I'm like, but I spend all this time saying, in a world of 4 regions comes, and then I've written, and I kind of like writing myself into a corner sometimes, because I feel like sometimes they're some of the most rewarding moments when you manage to write yourself back out of the corner. But I would hate to have limited myself to, these 4 regions or realms or whatever. And then suddenly I'm like, I've got this genius idea, or what I think is a genius idea for this other character, but I've got nowhere to put him. And I'm like, why did I set a rule that wasn't necessary? Why did I specifically say there were 4 how did it serve the story that there were 4? I mean, I guess if there's a plot reason why there's 4, otherwise it's, would you say stay away from specifying things that aren't integral to the story?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly no authority, so
no, this is two dudes that are learning by doing. So just take the bits that you agree with and ignore the rest of the nonsense that we're talking about.
I mean, I think it's always circumstantial. And in your circumstance, I guess I would. I mean, this is this is a perfect example of why an editorial element is really, really important. You would have an editor. That's a good question. We'll get back to it. Keep that up. So a good editor will be able to identify whether what you're doing is kind of an ass pull, or whether it's true to the story that you're telling. So I don't feel like I can give you a definitive answer to that, because we only know the bare basics of what you're talking about. But I think, I don't know how true it is that you should only know as much as you need for the story. I think that there is a really good argument to be made for knowing much, much more than that. And I think that you see them all throughout history. J.R. Tolkien is the prime example of having written a whole friggin' history for Middle Earth, and only telling a story in the 3rd age, I believe, which is kind of a masterful way to tell a story in and of itself, because if you identify for your reader that you're telling a story in the 3rd age, what's happening in the 1st and 2nd? I think that's really true, Dave. I think that you need to at least have an idea, right? It's I don't know. I think I apologize if I'm going in circles, but I think that you need to know where you want to go to at least some extent. I think that if you're just winging it, I think that that's a really risky way to write. But that depends on how big the story that you're trying to tell is. If you only have one issue in mind, then you're not necessarily going to create a world in which that could support 20 issues. So what was Zach's
I want to get to Zach's question, but I just wanted to sort of something you were saying, because there's a project that all right, forget it. I'll just write it down. We'll do Zach's question. So I would, I guess, say too much information that's not needed. What's the sort of first thing that comes to your mind when you think of what people do wrong?
I think it's sort of one thing that I think I've done wrong is at times is not known enough. So what do people do? I'm not giving the readers.
That's
so yeah, like when I was sort of writing the first things I ever wrote, and Chimera is a really good example of where I didn't know enough and I didn't tell the reader enough. And by that I mean that the literal world that story is set in is not not all that clear. You know, in the first issue, there are no establishing shots. I didn't write that into the script, and that's sort of something that I look back on, and I think that's, you know, your reader doesn't know, is this a small town? Is it a metropolis? Is it set in the future? Is it set in the past? I never talk about that, and I never make it clear.
Now you knew that, right? You just didn't.
I knew that,
right?
Maybe not enough though. At least not when I wrote the first script. So I probably didn't know enough until the third issue. So I probably knew things while writing the third script that I should have known when I started writing the first script. But I also think another thing that people do wrong is that they box themselves in, because I do that as well. I sort of will write rules into a script that probably weren't necessary, that make it really hard to figure a way out of it. Please don't ask me for an example. All I can tell you is that it's performed quite a few times. It was a really big experience writing superhero scripts. I've found them very hard. At least I did at first, because the world can seem limitless, but it can't be limitless. Like, there have to be rules.
Yeah. So I had this idea, and I did podcast years ago, and I just put the idea out there because the chances of me ever writing it / it taking place is slim. But it flies in the face of kind of world building, and I feel like one of the things people do wrong is maybe not having any rules. But so I had this idea for a trilogy of films where the first movie is it's starring Will Smith and Beyonce, and it's a witty, sort of clever, will they, won't they? You love both characters. You want to see them get together. Then they finally do. They're kissing at the big party. And then a huge ship comes over above and just starts blowing the city up. And suddenly, and then credits. So we spend 2 hours of this movie just loving the characters, loving the witty, weird sort of dialogue, and just enjoying them getting together. And then bang, it's aliens. And then then another movie comes out a year later, and it stars Will Smith and Beyonce playing the same characters, but they're in a runaway from the aliens movie. Will they survive? Oh no, they're almost going to survive. Oh, they're going to press the magic switch that kills all the aliens, and they don't press it, and nuclear bombs go off, and it's the apocalypse, and credits. And then movie 3, it's a post-apocalyptic movie starring Will Smith and a half robot Beyonce that got blown up in whatever. And we do this post-apocalyptic journey movie where we walk across the plains searching for food, which I feel would be fun, but it also laughs in the face of world building in terms of the story. Would you agree?
It's sort of treating genre like a joke, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what happens is that your audience won't know what they're getting into. Which maybe that sounds really appealing to a writer, but it's fraught with danger, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that. So I've been reading. For anyone that speaks to me on any sort of semi-regular basis, they know that I'm rereading Sandman right now, and I'm sort of obsessed with it all over again. And I think that the world building in the Sandman, which was written by Neil Gaiman in the 80s and 90s, is sort of almost the perfect example of how to build a world really, really well. So it's even with restrictions that Neil Gaiman had to sort of work around before he got to have full reign in terms of the first story arc is very much set in the DC universe, and you have sort of cameos from some of those characters. By the, I think, third volume or second even, it's entirely its own entity, and it doesn't really refer to the DC world at all. But so that story follows a character called Dream, and it's literally an endless being who's just basically a personification of a concept. That's a huge thing to ask a reader to get on board with. But the first issue starts with him being captured on Earth by a sect of magicians or whatever. So immediately you have a character that you can sympathize with, and then he has a hero's journey where he has to find a bunch of things on Earth. But what you get is that you only see his realm, the dreaming, after this first issue. So you spend all this time on Earth seeing what the influence of Dream being captured has on the humans, and only then do you actually experience the passage between the two worlds. One being a very real world that we can relate to, and then one being this entirely fantasy, abstract sort of place. And I think if it had started in this place, and you'd started with Dream being this sort of really all-powerful whatever, I'm not sure that you would as easily get on board. And that's sort of a series that it gets to play around with genre because of its infrastructure, its foundations. It's literally about stories. So 2 of the arcs are fantasy, and they're very hard fantasy, and by that point you're sort of on board. And then Neil Gaiman is very good at understanding the tropes and the conventions of those genres that he wants to play with, so that it's never jarring when he introduces you to one of them.
Cool. Guys, I'm just going to interrupt there because you guys are running out of time.
Yes. So I just wanted to say before we go, thank you very much, Haydn, for doing this with me. Shane, thank you so much for having us.
Of course.
Haydn and I and Ben Sullivan just spent 8 hours on Sunday together talking all this stuff. We could talk forever on sharing how we do this stuff. I build some worlds over at psychojanitor.com. That's where my books are. Haydn also has some books up at psychojanitor.com/Haydn Spurrell. You can follow links there to grab his books from places. Right now at Alternate Worlds, comic shop I worked at up until last week. They are having a mini convention today. Gary from Reverie is there selling some books, and Angie Spice is there. I'm sure other people are there too. They're just the 2 I know of. So if you're in the Bayswater area, eastern suburbs of Melbourne, head over there. Otherwise, obviously, keep it locked to Shane TV for the rest of the day. All kinds of good stuff. And tonight's drink and draw I'm looking forward to it because it's going to be
messy,
ridiculous. It could be the funniest, best fun time ever, or it could be nonsense. If any of this seemed like a thing, let me or Haydn know. At Spedsy is where you find me. At Haydn Spurrell is where you find Haydn. Because we've talked for a long time about doing a podcast together, talking to each other and then interviewing other people about this sort of stuff. If you think that that's a thing we should do, tell us to do it because we need a little bit of kick in the pants. Let me
just add that I don't think we talked about the artists enough. I know we touched on it a little bit.
No, I know.
So it's definitely something I would love to talk about more at some point. An hour is not long enough for this topic. If anyone has any thoughts about anything we discussed today, if you agree with this or you disagree with this, let us know. Send all your, cancel us if you need to, or just have a conversation with us because both of us would just love to.
Man, you'll be the first guest. Ben just said vodka. Yeah, Ben will be the first guest because we obviously both love working with him, and also I love the Haydn's the artist, I'm the writer artist, and then there's the artist, and there's the kind of we play all the different.
Nice.
Yeah. And sometimes we are exactly on the right page, and other times we think polar oppositely. So yeah, and we make words up like polar oppositely. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you very much, guys. So I'm going to have to cut you off, or I won't be able to do the next one. Great. It was great listening to you guys. I got a little bit too enthralled with what you're saying and not doing what I was meant to be doing. So thank you. And yes, definitely, I'm voting with the other guys. Do a podcast. That was awesome. I'd like to see more than just an hour of this. Yes.
Right.
Awesome.
Cool. What about just listening to it? So then we don't have to have our faces on.
Yeah, either or.
Yeah.
You can do both. You can do both. That's the beauty of technology.
Oh.
Cool. Well, I better let everyone go.
Yeah.
See you at the next one.
Yeah, I'll see you in just a minute.
At ACBD. And that's where the next one will be. And see you there. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Haydn. Thanks, Spedsy. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you're after some more Aussie Comic Book Day goodness, just go to the link comx.cx and check out the schedule. Thank you very much.